ho! Hello there. Since this is my channel, it stands to reason that my name is Christopher Reusch, and I have, one may say, been given the task of sharing with the world my perspective on climate change. And my perspective on climate change has been shaped throughout my studies as an environmental protection engineer. For anybody who's interested in my background, check out my website in the About section. There's also the certificate, if there's still anyone doubting it. Now I would like to run you through the basic principles of climate change that are often left out, because the sole focus seems to be on carbon dioxide. Now in this version of, this is climate change, and this is how the climate is actually changing, you will realize that it is a little different and, in my opinion, a little more accurate. Now let's first look at the basic layout of a functioning ecosystem in the most, or terrestrial ecosystem, in the most ideal sense. I have tried to keep this very simple for myself and for anybody watching it. So when I look at this picture, what I see is, first of all, big trees. Now, big trees can produce enough pressure to suck up water from the lower regions of the earth, which you could consider groundwater. Now, most deciduous trees, so leaf-carrying trees that discard their leaves once a year, have a very extensive root system. That can be related to the human circulatory system, which also has like big veins and arteries, but also small blood vessels and capillaries, and that's then how the roots of a tree are. And as much as the roots of the tree reach down into the ground, the foliage of a tree reaches into the atmosphere with green leaves on top. And now if you have something like a forest, which means several trees whose canopy connects somehow and therefore creates shade from sunshine. Now, if you imagine that there's sunshine coming down from above and hitting the leaves, which all carry chlorophyll, for photosynthesis, which is the process of using, I think it's carbon dioxide, water maybe, and energy from the sun, and then turning it into oxygen, water, and whatever, I think there's also nitrogen or whatever in there, I'm not really here to discuss science so much. because science to me doesn't always make sense. This to me makes absolute sense, because anybody who's ever been in a forest in summer on a hot day will have to agree with me that the climate within the forest was colder or cooler than outside of the forest. Now, why is that? You know, I could go into now how the trees make nutrients accessible, bring water up, right? Up from the lower region of the earth. They bring it up to the upper regions of the tree. And therefore they make water accessible, but also nutrients. Because in the soil there are all kinds of microorganisms digesting debris like dead leaves and stuff, but also dead animals. There's all kinds of animals like worms and mouses and moles that dig up the ground, but also stuff like pigs or warthogs that dig tunnels that allow water to penetrate when it rains deeper into the ground, so it keeps the ground loose and moist. And of course, animals also shit, they defecate, which is basically very nutrient-rich fertilizer without any chemistry. And just basic forest stuff, you probably have, like, depending on the forest, moss, or you also have lichens and stuff, which are remarkable things, but you also have grass and flowers. This was my idea of a fern. Yeah, this is like, well, is this a carnivore or a human? Who knows? Right? Animals that are certainly carnivoric. This is just a representative of, how a carnivore might look like. But the essential thing of a forest are big trees, because only big trees can reach down far enough into the ground to bring up groundwater above the surface. And why is that important? In addition, of course, to all the nutrients they gather up, by sometimes going into some kind of symbiosis with some kind of bacteria colonies, because these flowers, they won't reach very far down. And anybody who's ever dug up grass will realize that the roots, they also don't really reach far down, and neither do the roots of bushes. So it's only trees that have such an extensive network of roots that bring up nutrients and water. And so let's just move one picture ahead. And now we see sunshine, right? It's like a form of energy, very, very dense energy coming towards us, somewhat diluted. And now you've got two arrows here, right? This is me simplifying whatever I remember and have picked up ever since my studies. And then you have these roots, these rays, right? Sun rays, which work on a certain frequency, and they whoosh, shoot onto the leaves, which provide shadow and protection from direct sunlight under the canopy. This is already one effect of cooling. But anybody who's been inside a house in summer, like during hot periods, also knows that these houses also heat up in some sense. So first of all, space is created under which you can be safe from like a lot of sunlight. But now the leaves, they also do something. And this is what I then refer to as photosynthesis, which is basically taking water and all kinds of things, look it up if you really like that. I don't really need to know a lot about photosynthesis, but I know that people think it exists. And so this ray of the sun like goes and hits a leaf, right? And then the leaf takes that energy basically as can you call it an inductor or something, right? A reaction is being induced or something. And that's then photosynthesis, through which plant matter is created. I think phosphor is also a part of that, but who knows, right? And water is being created through photosynthesis and oxygen, and that can then be seen from the perspective of a leaf as sweating. And you know from yourself that if it's a hot day, or you exercise, but let's stay with a hot day, you sweat. And sweating is a way of cooling a system by bringing water from the inside to the outside, including the heat. So it's a form of transportation of heat through water from one system to another, or from one system to the outside of one system. And in that case, the heat that is being gathered inside the leaves is basically given up through photosynthesis and then sweating into the atmosphere. And as these pores of leaves and stuff, they're probably quite fine. So it's like more like vapor. So you have a process that is called evapotranspiration. Now transpiration obviously is sweating. Vapo is like vapor, right? Water vapor. E for me, that's like energy. But evapotranspiration is basically the process of green foliage emitting water vapor into the atmosphere when hit with sunlight. And now leaves cover large areas, and all the leaves, I assume, will do this. Maybe you've got some stubborn ones, but generally I would suggest all the leaves that are being hit by the sunlight will do photosynthesis, and they will produce oxygen and water, amongst others, or release them, because they're considered more like byproducts, right? And then you've got water vapor with that kind of heat energy going up into the atmosphere because warm water rises, or warm air rises, and it's basically taking away heat from this system and bringing it up into the higher atmospheres. That cools down this system close to the ground where most animals live, including us, which I don't consider as animals, but that's just perspective, I think. And together with the water vapor, this then rises up into the atmosphere and accumulates. And this then eventually, occasionally, leads to the formation of clouds. And I think that happens when cold air masses come in or something, and then clouds form because cold water takes up less. Cold air can take up less water. And so eventually, when there's a lot of air, water in the air, you will then have rain. And that then means that water has been brought up from underground to the leaves, evaporated through evapotranspiration, in combination with sunlight and stuff, found its way into the atmosphere and then rains down again. This is the basic principle of any forest. So, looking at the Amazonian rainforest and thinking that that's the only rainforest is complete bullshit, because any forest is a rainforest. Maybe what's very specific about the Amazonian rainforest is because it's somewhat steady, of course, if humans don't cut it down or something, right? So it's a very stable climate. Here in Europe we have seasons and stuff. But generally any forest is a rainmaker. And it fertilizes the soil, it offers protection, and by making rain, it also makes sure the land doesn't dry out, it stays fertile, things can grow, and all kinds of things. And now I didn't really paint this, but let's just imagine you take out these trees because you think, they're really valuable, and you want to burn them because you feel cold, right? And you don't want to work for being hot, and you want to cook on that. Or you just want to make an expensive designer table out of it. Then you cut down these trees, and let's say you cut down all of them, or you cut them down in large areas. What does that mean? The very thing that created the rain is gone. And now there's nothing left anymore for this snake thingy to, hide and jump on you. And there's nothing bringing up nutrients anymore for these plants. There's nothing shading them anymore. There's nothing to shade the grass anymore. And usually the most luscious tufts of grass are to be found under trees, because that's where the most nutrients are. And that means, like herbivores, they will have less food to eat. Carnivores will have ultimately then also less food to eat. They will stop shitting, and once they're gone, or maybe hunted to extinction, they will also stop defecating, which means generally less nutrient-rich soil also. Right? And if then the sun, because now you've got no rain and never any cloud cover, so the sun, right, keeps hitting the ground, it will dry up, and all this grass and all the flowers, they will wither away, and the soil will harden. Over time it will get harder and harder. And that also means then for moles and mice and worms, end of game. There's nothing to do there anymore but die or leave. And what that then creates over time is this: a pile of sand or dust or dirt, or however you would like to call this. I call this the desert. Now, this is one form of desert. Modern cities is another one. And anyone who's been ever in the desert, or anyone who's ever been in a city, will also have to agree with me that these habitats are quite hot. Especially cities. Concrete heats up to quite a high amount and gives up the heat during the night, which means that it's generally quite hot because there's basically a reservoir of heat. And if you're living in an area where there's no forest, then you will probably very soon also have little rain, which means accumulation of dirt over time, which will make breathing harder and all kinds of problems. And it all started by taking out the trees without replacing them. Because felling trees isn't really the issue. It's the felling of trees without replacing them. Now, I wanted to keep this short. Now, you've got a desert. And now one could say, well, there's still moisture in the air, and sometimes clouds come from other areas to rain down over barren land, right? And yeah, for sure. But now comes another problem, which is that these surfaces, they heat up. And so if you have an acre that is being farmed by humans, where there's no large trees that bring up moisture from underground, where you have to water these things yourself if there is a dry season, but generally a field in a hot day in summer is much hotter than a forest. And anybody who's ever been on any field can also agree on that. And that's of course what people want. They want monocultures because they're easy to farm and to produce large sums of food. Mostly probably for meat production, which is another issue for another video. So what happens when you have now a region unprotected by canopy? Well, it accumulates heat because there's no shade from above, right? And there's no rain being generated by bringing up water from underground. So this could be an acre as well, right, where corn is being farmed. It means that this piece of land, it will heat up, and because it's heating up, hot air begins to rise, right? Like you can just turn on an oven plate, like a stove, right? You turn on the heat of the stove and you place your hand above, and you will realize that a couple of centimeters above you can still feel the heat, right? You can just look at basic principles like your radiator. In winter you turn it on, and if you would take some incense, you would see that hot air rises, which you can then see through the smoke, and then it brings it, right, creates turbulence in the room, moving hot and cold air masses around. But if you have huge areas that accumulate heat and radiate heat, cold air masses are being pushed out. And because then the only thing that remains is heat, you have no real turbulence anymore. It's just heat. There's no cold air mixing in, because I also believe it's due to the mixing or the interplay between cold and hot air masses that, wind is being generated, but also rain comes into existence by the cooling down of the atmosphere and the changing in temperature. The atmosphere can hold less water and then it rains down, because hot air can generally accumulate more water and cold air less. So if you have like warm air with lots of water in, and then cold air comes in, it rains down. And it's the same principle when you're in winter indoors and you have the radiator on and it gets very hot, and then you open the window occasionally to let in cold air, and then you close it and you heat it up again. You become very dry air in the rooms, because every time you open the window, hot air with water goes out, and cold air with little water comes in, and then you heat it up again, and that means you have very little water indoors, which then means you should probably have some kind of vaporizer to add extra moisture. So that's the same principle. There's just heat. Heat, heat, heat. And it's rising up and it's pushing out cold air. And that means no rain. And that means a desert. And that means exactly climate change. So you can change the climate of a specific area by introducing the very principle that we've been introducing all over the world. Germany, I don't cling to numbers, but I have a number in my head and says something like Germany was covered to 90%, I think even over the Netherlands, with forest. Now what's left? Maybe 5%, 10%, right? Very little. There's basically no forest anywhere. Just small patches, but that isn't enough to produce rain in adequate amounts. And that's when you realize that all the lakes get lower. But what gets higher is the water level in the oceans. Like we're saying it's because the ice caps are melting. Well, that may be one reason, but another reason is that dry soil, or like in the desert, the dry soil cannot take up water because there are no tunnels anymore made by moles or worms or mice. There are no roots anymore that dig up and loosen the earth. And that means all the water that rains down washes away into the next river and finds its way into the ocean. And that means we're basically, through our behavior, channeling water that has been accessible and actively flowing around on land areas, on terrestrial terrain, is now being sent back to the ocean. And that will probably continue to happen until we realize that just looking at CO2 or greenhouse gases, right, and marketing them is maybe a solution for creating a market for something, but certainly not for cooler climate. So if we want cooler climate, we also have to accept that we need trees. And when we want cooler climate, and we need trees and we plant trees, we will have more rain. And that means we better get used to the idea that if we want cooler climate, we need more rain, we need more trees and forests, like large areas covered by forest. And that also means we have to change the way our cities look, which means we have to start being gardeners again. I mean, that's the basic principles of climate change in a nutshell. And I'm sure the concrete industry is very happy about, cars and streets and stuff. But ultimately, everybody's shouting, "Oh, climate change!" But nobody wants to do shit about it. And we can all look to the Amazonian rainforest and say, oh, look at these savages, right? Oh, look with his little spear. Oh, he's half naked. Oh. Yeah, and then you see beautiful birds of paradise, but these things are just documentaries. People don't really give a shit anymore about this. What they care about is having a smartphone and checking, Facebook statuses or something. Right? They want to look at stuff on Instagram. They don't really give a shit about anything anymore because their mind is literally being captured by large corporations. But ultimately, we cannot blame them as well because, right, it's like self-responsibility. You are responsible for your actions. And if you think people are saving the planet for you, then you're wrong. because you're part of the problem, so you can be part of the solution as well, which is starting to ask questions instead of just gobbling up what you're being fed with. Because if somebody's shouting really loud to get your attention, then it's either like, hey, listen, right? I mean, you're drowning, I've got a life jacket for you. Or it's, you've got money, come here, I want some of it. Right? This is like industrialism. This is capitalism. Making money from basically anything. And so you can also tell the world that carbon dioxide, it's your fault that the environment is dying because you're driving a car and that emits carbon dioxide amongst others. But carbon dioxide is the worst. Yeah, maybe you should stop breathing then, because that emits carbon dioxide as well. And right, then they sell you different kinds of petrol which are supposed to save the climate, which also in turn use, like sometimes they use kind of petrol mixed with ethanol, which is being produced by producing large amounts of plants. And I've read that 1 kilo of wheat uses up, in the cycle of its production, up to 2,000 liters. And a kilo of beef, now listen to this, between 15,000 liters of water, up to 70,000, that's a study I found online, right? 15, like that's 15 and then 3 zeros, 1,000 liter of water for 1 kilo of beef that you're eating. And the reason why that is because the beef is being fed what? Plant material. So you first have to grow the plants that we humans could live on without problem. I'm living vegan apart from occasional eggs, but like imagine how much one bull or a cow eats in its life to produce the meat that we want it to have. That uses up a lot of water, and then you have to feed the cattle also still water, and then you just kill it. And then you do that 1,000,000 times, and then you say, well, it's carbon dioxide. No, it's bullshit. Anyway, like I said, I wanted to keep it short. I think that's climate change in a nutshell, as nutty as I can give it to you. And I'm sure there's people that will say, but that doesn't make sense. Well, there's a guy who's called Professor John D. Luy, L-U-Y, or I, and he's done research on this kind of stuff, and if you're interested in this, there's tons of documentaries about him, John D. Luy, and he basically learned how to renaturalize habitats that have been considered as deserts and to make them into a habitat which is green again and yields crops and produces its own rain basically and can hold the water that comes down through the rain. Anyway, that's basically it. In case you're interested in my work or myself, check out my website, check out my Instagram channel. I also have some short stories on Medium, I've written books, whatever, right? Check it out and start thinking about things until you have formed an opinion instead of allowing other people to form your opinion, because people who have an intention to form your opinion usually have some kind of agenda. They won't tell you what I tell you because they don't want you to know. Because if you know this, you know that all this stuff about carbon dioxide is just bullshit. And another term I'm going to throw into you is like greenwashing. Yeah. Anyway, that's roughly it. Cheers.